In this video, I'm gonna show you my definitive guide on how to draw clothing using concepts that are easy to grasp. And you will learn, once and for all, how to dress up your characters the right way. Coming up. To start off, let's think of the letter I. There is a type of fold that is pretty common, which is the pipe fold. Pipe fold occurs when the drapery falls relatively parallel to one another. That's why I think of them as a series of I shapes. If I stack them up side by side and connect them with a circular shape, I will get half-cylinder formats that actually resemble organ pipes, hence the name. This type of fold can be found on curtains, long dresses, tablecloths, and so on. If you tilt the pipes a little bit towards a condensed area and draw them in different sizes, you will have a skirt, where each of those pipes has its own tension point on the rod that holds them up. In order to give them a convincing look, you can add some shadows between the pipes. This adds depth and volume to the overall structure. When you shift the perspective from the bottom up and vary the size and format of each pipe, you get a more comic-like skirt. You can use this approach when you want to inject more life and movement into your character. The next shapes we're going to see are the U shape and the V shape. The U shape, also known as diaper fold, occurs when there are two or more tension points on the top edges of the cloth, forming a U or smile shape in between. This type of fold can be found on superhero capes or when you laid out the fabric on the clothesline. Notice that emphasizing the dark shadows underneath the cape and the addition of shadings between the pipes really helps to add volume to the drawing. Drop folds, on the other hand, occur when the cloth is held by a single anchor point while being bunched up. Just try to hang a towel in your bathroom and you will see. The cloth assumes a cone-like shape on its upper half while it tends to become wider at the bottom, forming a V shape. Also, notice how the shadows play an important role separating the layers of the fold. The two other remaining letter types of folds are the Z and Y shapes. The Z or zigzag fold occurs when the fold crumples down when meeting a point of resistance, just like the sleeve in this drawing. The resistance is the sleeve itself that is rolled up and compresses the fold. You can also find a zigzag fold on the bottom of some pants when it meets the foot area, like this one I'm drawing here. The gravity pushes the folds to the bottom until they compress and form a zigzag shape. A half-lock fold occurs when the form changes direction, thus compressing the fabric. This type of fold is very common when you bend the legs, the forearm, or inside the armpit, as you can see in this drawing. The dominant shape that results from it resembles the Y letter. The Y is also visible in foreshortened poses, since the shapes nearest to the camera overlap those that are further away. Obviously, we are dealing with simplification, but you can think of this concept even when you're drawing more realistic fabric. A trick that I like to use is to divide the fabric with a seam and render just one of the sides. This tends to work really well in comic styles. Similar to the zigzag fold, a spiral fold happens when we add a twisting force to an underlying cylindrical form. We regularly see them in sleeves around arms, primarily when they change directions. Notice how the folds wrap around the right arm of the character, almost like a spiral. Let's take a look at another example. As the character twists his torso, the fabric forms several spiral shapes around his arms. The fabric on the back of the suit pulls toward a single tension point below the armpit, and the folds radiate from it. We can also see a very subtle indication of a diaper fold between his shoulders. In order to be convincing, I treat certain types of fabric differently. When drawing certain materials such as jeans, I tend to use more lines and create more contrast with shadows and soft hatching. Also, try to enrich the fabric information by adding details such as pockets, zippers, and seams. This helps the viewer to recognize the character's outfit more easily. Notice how I cast the shadow below the collar, on the pockets, and between the arms and body. Not every cloth has the same type of fold though. Some cloths, such as hoodies, has fewer and thicker folds due to their density, while thinner materials have sharper folds. Thicker fabrics have smoother and more spacious folds. When drawing pants, the same principle is applied. Here I am building the underdrawing before adding the details. Notice the pipe folds radiating from the groin section. Also, notice how I darkened the legs right below the knees to give depth to the drawing. Try to add information to the fabric as much as you can and vary your lines to avoid monotonous folds. Understanding how everything works are just one piece of the puzzle. You have to inject your personality into the drawing to make it look cool. There is a more complicated type of fold, which is the inert fold. Its format is hard to predict because there are too many types of forces happening simultaneously. There isn't a right way to draw them, but it's recommended to use a reference for it, as I did with this drawing you're seeing here. It's pretty much a bunch of layers overlapping each other, where you can identify all the previous folds we studied happening all over the form. I also like to play with light and shadows to create contrast and help the viewer to understand the subject. Speaking of light, different surfaces reflect the light differently and therefore need to be rendered accordingly. I'm gonna draw this character using a leather jacket to show you what I mean. After setting up a dark value, I trace a path in the center portion of the fabric that represents the light reflecting off the jacket. Notice how these kind of jackets are much more attached to the silhouette of the character rather than other softer cloth. Same thing for the folds. I keep going back and forth, refining each fold and placing some hatching lines that represent the transition between light and dark values. Once again, I'm not worried about being realistic. I just wanted to sell this drawing as something believable. Now that I have everything in place, I like to enhance the lighter portion even further. Here I'm using a soft brush in overlay mode to make the jacket look cooler. Other materials such as latex are much more reflective and tight to the body than other types of fabric and have that glossy look on them. The secret here is to highlight the areas of the body when there's a plane change and increase the value in some portions where there's light bouncing off. Once you understand how drapery works, you will have a powerful tool to enhance your character drawings, including their movements and gestures. Try to mix different types of folds, fabrics, and textures, and let your imagination flow. Just bear in mind that drapery in general follows the rules of gravity. So, in essence, folds are constantly pulled down to the ground, unless you have other tension points acting on them. As an exercise, try to find every kind of fold that appears in these two drawings. So let's take a look at some old drawings to identify the types of folds we learned today. Let's start with the bottom section of that dress. The first thing we can notice here is the use of pipe folds. Each piece of fabric has its own tension point, as we can see the pipes relatively parallel to each other. Notice that I used very confident lines with variations in their format. It makes the drawing look dynamic and vivid. I also added some inert folds on the outer edges of the drapery. It's very subtle, but it helps to sell the dress as something realistic. Then I added some folds crossing the seam of her dress in order to break the flow of these long legs, just for fun. And also, very subtle lines indicate a tension coming from the single point here, created due to the position of her hips. This kind of thing produces spiral folds, where folds that wrap around cylindrical forms radiate from a single point. Here we have folds compressed by her waistline. Remember that we can use the Z shape in this case. And since we're talking about gravity, it's worth mentioning this detail in her dress. Notice that even when the body is tilted to the side, these hanging objects point to the ground vertically. This kind of thing seems obvious to point out, but I see mistakes like that happening all the time, so be careful. And what about those giant gloves? We did the same thing with the leather jacket, right? The highlight represents the spot when there's a plane change on the underlying surface. And notice that the glove is really tied to her forearm, so it's the perfect scenario to use it. Another great example we can explore is my famous piece of these Disney princesses enjoying the quarantine and trying to have a good conversation. Notice the Y symbol representing a directional shift from the shoulder line to Alice's arm. Let's decrease the opacity. We have the same thing happening to the other characters. All of these create half-lock folds. Alice has some folds crumbling down in this section. So we will have the Z or zigzag shape. And another one here. And depending on the extension, we can also have spiral folds. Notice that the fabric here on Belle doesn't have too many folds due to its density. Let's search for more. We have some pipe folds here at the bottom of Alice's dress. Very subtle, nothing fancy. We have more pipe folds on Ariel's skirt, following the format of her legs. And notice the V shape here. There are several, to be honest. We can interpret this as drop folds because they are held by a single tension point, located on Belle's knee. Notice that everything radiates from it. Lastly, we also have some inert folds on the sides of her skirt. That's the way I chose to represent the fabric resting on the couch. Now let's take a look at some shiny fabric. starting off with Catwoman in her latex outfit. Here we have a big block of highlight following the path of her muscles, and also here on the side of her trunk. That is because there is a huge plane change that divides the front and back sides of her body. So this area is probably receiving the most amount of light on it. I also added highlights here that represent the scapula, which is a triangular bone located here. Also, here in the glows we have a highlight dividing the plane changes. I also added this rendering effect by dithering the lines to mimic the transition between light and shadow, useful to represent gray tones. And obviously on Batman we have some highlights on his cape as well. It really gives the impression that the cape is wrapping around his shoulder, down to his arms and to the back. Even the cat's bow has a highlight where the plane changes. Some fabrics are too tight to the body and barely show any kind of folds or something alike. Looking at this Spider-Man piece that I drew a while back, we can see that I decided to put some parts in evidence that in my mind are receiving the most amount of light. That is pretty much guessing work from my side. I try to think of the body parts where the muscles bump out a little bit, and leave the other sections in the dark. I'm not worried about realism, I only want my character to look cool. There are some parts where you can add some folds or wrinkles, such as the wrist section, as I did here. It's a practical way to add realism and reinforce to the audience that your character is wearing an outfit. Portraying gravity through the use of drapery in illustrations is one of the most time-consuming subjects for aspiring artists, and now you have a framework that you can rely on when you need to draw them. My intention is to give you just the right amount of knowledge so that you can start on your own with confidence. You don't need to learn difficult names and concepts. Start slowly building analogies around simple shapes and you will see improvements over time. That's my personal way of teaching and how I get the best results from my students. And by the way, if you want to learn how to draw the faces and expressions you saw in this tutorial, I have a masterclass where I deliver all of my secrets in a simple way, with topics that go from gaining confidence to coloring a character from start to finish. And better yet, I will personally review each of your entries, sometimes even redrawing over them, to show you the best way to approach each topic, which is something you won't find in other courses out there. I'll leave the link in the description in case you're interested. So that's pretty much it. Did you learn something? Leave your comments down below. And if you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. I'm trying to drop a video like this every now and then, and your feedback is much appreciated. See you next time, stay safe and keep practicing. See you next time, stay safe and keep practicing.